Hello, Jane. How are you?
Hello, Andrew. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too, you too. And hello, everyone who's watching. A very warm welcome back to the History Geeks. And today we're going to discuss a film that we both love. It's another classic from the 90s. There's no getting away from that fantastic decade. And today we are going to be talking over Last of the Mohicans, which I believe came out in 1992,
Yep.
was it, Jane?
Yes,
Yeah.
it did. And it's based, of course, on Cooper's classic from 1826. Will you believe it? It's
Good
actually,
Lord.
yes. And it was a classic, surprisingly few film adaptations of this one, sort of compared to other great classics. But this one was epic, the one coming out in the 90s in many, many, many ways. And Andrew, should we just maybe talk first a little bit about the background, the historical background, and what's happening here? Where are we, and who are we with, and what's going on?
Yeah, so yeah, no, that would be great. So I mean, it's again, it's a bit early for me, but in terms of historical interest, but it is a conflict I find fascinating. So it's set in North America, Canadian border, that sort of area, in 1757. So it's the sort of early slash middle bit of what the Americans call the French and Indian War and what we call the 7 Years' War, particularly the bit between Britain and France. And it's a very complex situation because you've got all these First Nations peoples, all of whom, they're either fighting each other or they have agreements with the European colonizers, the British and the French. So they have their own conflicts. They end up being drawn into these colonial conflicts between the Brits and the French. And it's a very interesting mess, really, of conflicting interests, but set in one of the most beautiful parts of the world. And I've got to admit that the cinematography and the views you get of the wilderness are
Yeah.
just amazing. So beautiful. It's tragic because you've got so much beauty and it's marred by all this conflict. Although I've got to say though, people knew how to dress for war back then. There's a particular magnificence about the uniforms. But yes, so this is the background to the story, and all the main characters are sort of trying to sort of push through life and
Yes.
do what they're trying to do against this very complicated background.
Brilliantly summarized, Andrew. And also, you have these, as you said, this is complex business because you have these different Native American tribes, and they ally with what whoever they share interest with, or whoever happens to be the dominating part in whatever territory they might be in. And even after the British or the English victory, uh, the situation was still very complex indeed. I mean, there wasn't really, I was about to say, peaceful solution to this. This was conflicted areas, especially, as you say, around the border areas, for a very, very long time to come.
Yes, yeah, and you're right. The problems never go away because both European powers use the Native American Indians as allies, but neither of them fully trusts them at the same time. And certainly some of the British. I mean, rather tragically, there was a British general named Amherst who admittedly was a bit extreme for his time. We don't see him in this story, but he's there in the background of this conflict. And he was very keen on the idea of getting rid of the Indians after the war, once the French had been defeated, up to and including those who'd actually sided with the British, which was a bit mean of him. To put him into context, some of his colleagues thought he was rather, mean wanting to do this. But people like him were about. And yes, yeah, the broadly speaking, the tribes in the north tended to favor the French because that's where the French colonies and their trading partners were, whereas those further to the south, on the whole, were either neutral or sided with the British. The French diplomatically tended to have more success in bringing the Indian tribes onto their side. with the British, it was a bit of a slower process, and it shows really. You see in the film the huge advantage one side has through having more Indian allies than the other.
True, true. But you also said, Andrew, we joined this in 1757 in the summer, I think, which was probably, so this was about 3 years or so into the conflict, I believe. But this was probably also the most tense and insecure period of that conflict, because everything, as you said, was still very much up in the air, and you didn't really know yet to which side this was falling out. And in the middle, you have the settlers, of course, and you have who are very much caught in the middle of all of this, and you have these various tribes fighting each other at the same time as they join sides. So this is probably the most complicated it gets during this particular year.
Yes, yes, and things are very fluid because in 1757 the French cause is riding quite high. They have tended to win more of the battles, but the French also have a problem, and that's resources. And you don't see this so much in the film, but the British failures on land had not been reflected at sea, and the French were having major problems trying to bring in fresh troops and supplies. So although their governors and generals were doing quite well, they were becoming painfully aware that their men and their ammunition were a finite, dwindling resource, and they weren't quite there yet, but within another year or so, they would be in the position where they were struggling even to afford to win battles because
Yeah.
every time you fight, you lose men and you expend your supplies. The British were beginning to build up their strength, and they were slowly coming round to the idea that you need to get more Indians on side because of the nature of this country and the kind of war you're
Very
fighting.
hostile in a way. As you said, as beautiful as it is, it's also hostile if you don't know your way around.
Yes, yeah, and both sides rely on the Indian scouts. In fact, they even refer to them several times in the film where you scouts, tell me this, tell me that, and you needed them. The war had actually begun spectacularly badly for the British because a general named Braddock had led a column to attack a French fort, Fort Duquesne,
Mm.
and he had some Cherokee scouts with him, but he only had six of them to scout ahead of his entire force. And so they did their best, but the French defenders of Duquesne, who had an awful lot more Indians than Braddock did, they basically ambushed his column and made a terrible mess of it. In fact, one of the participants was a very young George Washington on the British side. So who knows how that might have changed history if a French aligned Indian had aimed just a little bit to the right. But that's a bit of alternate history for you. But yes, the British learned a very painful lesson there, but it took them a while to implement the changes they
I
need.
also wanted to ask you, Andrew, because we get a glimpse of life at these forts, especially as we in the movie we get to Fort William Henry, and just how how I was about to say well organized, and how were they actually functioning and operating in the middle of this landscapes, and also in this conflict between constant figuring out which tribes can we rely on, and where do we go, and how do we strategically attack anything in this very hostile environment.
It was a really tough assignment being put in charge of one of these forts because you had multiple functions, and I actually really love all the scenes that take place in William Henry because it's such a beautifully constructed picture of life on the frontier at the time. And some of my friends said to me when I first watched the film with them that were there actually families in the forts? Because of course you see women and children, and the answer is yes. These weren't just military installations; they were trading posts and small towns as well. And so, as the governor in charge, you were normally a military man if you were the governor. You not only had to organize your own soldiers as you would in a military base, you'd also have to oversee the day-to-day running of your town. So you're a mayor as well as
Yeah.
a colonel, and it was an incredibly difficult assignment because on the one hand, your masters, either in Paris or London, are wanting you to maintain the profitability of the colony by trading with as many Indians as you can. At the same time, as you say, you have to figure out which ones you can trust, because every time you invite someone into your fort, you're giving them a good look at it. And at the same time, you also have to make sure you're self-sufficient. You know, do we have enough farmland around our fort to be able to feed ourselves? What do we do if there's an emergency? Because even the largest forts, you never had enough farmland inside your fort to feed your population. Have I stored up enough in case my neighbors turn nasty? And
Or complicated this, but we also see, you know, the different tension that happens between people within the fort, because there were uprisings and there were conflicts, you know, and also as we see, you know, there were people having families that they needed to protect, maybe far away.
Yes, for the settlers, and I think this is also beautifully illustrated. There is the great conflict of interest where, you know, some of you volunteer to fight for, you know, king and country, but you're painfully aware that you're leaving your farms essentially unprotected behind you. Um, and of course, if you did hear that, you know, hostile tribes or soldiers had been raiding your farms, of course you want to go back and protect them, you know, oath notwithstanding. It was a trigger for much mutual frustration because officers newly arrived from Europe, both French and British, used to get really frustrated about this because they're used to the men, you know, damn well doing what they're told because I'm the officer and they're the soldiers. But with the settlers on both sides, it was very much more of a contractual sort of thing. And if you didn't like the terms of your contract anymore, there were mechanisms that you could employ in order to leave, you know, as you can in civilian life. You know, sorry, you're not honoring the contract, so I'm not doing this anymore. And culturally, for the Indians too, alliances were very seasonal. They weren't binding in the same way that Europeans would expect them to be. And let's face it, Europeans could be pretty hypocritical about treaties as well. But you know, we like to be legalistic. You signed on the dotted line, so you are my friend. But to most, certainly for you know the Cherokee, the Mohawks, and various, if you you know if you've done your bit for a season, there's nothing to necessarily bind you to these guys next year when you send your raiding part. In fact, you might even be fighting each other, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. That's just the way life is. So
And
yes, a very, very difficult situation with a lot of tension. And you're also right that within the walls of the same fort, the alliances are not always easy because again, you get the professional soldiers, you know, this is our job. We're here to defend this place. Settlers who are like, well, either I'll stay here and defend it because my family lives here, or oh God, how can I leave?
yeah.
And I know I'm letting the soldiers down, but my family comes first. And quite a few Indians who are also thinking, did we make the right choice in who we sided with? Yeah.
Course. And you touch on another very interesting subject there, Andrew, which is of course these very, very different cultures. And one thing I remember when I first watched this a thousand years ago, it seems, that very first scene in the movie where we see the hunt, the family and the organization of a family hunting a deer and the respect for nature. I remember
Mm.
that being something that was sort of coming back in a way into the cultural focus in the 90s as well, that we had moved away from nature quite a bit, but the Indians and the story of the Indians were very much what brought us back to that feel of living with nature. Whereas, you know, the military people on both sides come with all their organization and their structure and their, you know, orders and their organized life, but the Native Americans had to live in pact with nature in order to survive. And of course, that becomes the key in this type of environment. And the conflict there to understand that, you know, as long as we're well organized, we will survive, you know, and on the other hand, you have the Native Americans going, yeah, no, we sort of follow whatever flow nature gives us, you know. That starts to seep in as well, I think, also in those scenes at the fort.
I think you're absolutely right with those, Jane. And yes, it was a strengthening theme in the 90s because if I remember rightly, this movie followed very closely on the heels of Dances with Wolves,
Yes,
didn't it?
you're
Yeah,
right.
we
Very
with
much did.
very much the same kind of emphasis. And yes, because the mere existence of cities like Albany and the forts, the Europeans come in and they cut the trees down and they build forts. So they create their environment and then live in it. Whereas the Indians, as you say, they live within the environment and they don't make massive changes to it. And it is a very interesting clash of cultures. They don't, as I recall, they don't overstate it in the film, which I like. They keep it subtle. It doesn't make it preachy, but it's there all the time. And yes, the hunting scene is very moving. I love the bit where they're almost, thanking their quarry or thanking the spirit of their
Yes.
quarry before they take it home and cook it.
And
Uh,
then we admire your strength and so on. That's a very there's something very beautiful about that. But I think we also get to see a little bit in those first conversations between Hawkeye and Cora, where she directly says to him, "We really don't understand what's going on here." Uh,
yeah.
and her, of course, and her sister being completely taken out of their environment and into this absolutely impossible situation. But it does highlight, I think, for the viewer and for the story as well, just how different these cultures were, and also how maybe looked down on they were at the time, especially by one thing with the military people, but also maybe settlers and so on, who didn't perhaps respect it so much.
Yes, yeah, and you can always spot the difference because although it's a little bit stereotyped, I find it's very telling how the settlers, especially the second and third generation ones, they gel with the Indians very nicely for the most part. Maybe slightly more nicely than was the case historically, but there is that easy flow of cultures. Whereas the new arrivals from Europe, who seem to turn up absolutely convinced of their cultural and I think they fall victim to their technical superiority too, and it goes to their heads and they go, oh yeah, these people and it's so subtle. And I think there's that bit where General Webb is introducing Mugwort to Duncan Hayward, and he can't even remember his name. He's like, oh, that fellow, the Indian, the scout,
Yeah.
and you just think, yeah, even if he was really an ally of yours rather than someone who's just pretending, perhaps a little more respect because you do need these people, don't just expect him to go, oh yes, sir, thank you for noticing me, sir. But yeah, he's very offhand with him.
Yeah.
And to some degree, Colonel Munro as well, even though he has good reasons for wanting to keep his force within the fort. But he's very dismissive of the concerns of everyone, and he takes for granted that the Indians will stay and do what he wants them to do.
That's the moment where you feel like he's definitely putting on his military hat, because he's as you said, he's very much talking as the leader in command there. He's thinking as a military man in that situation. But you do get the impression that he's also behind that facade. There is a sensibility, and I think especially in that negotiation with his French opponent, where they have to vacate the fort,
Mm.
actually that deal is not that bad when you think about it. I mean, of course they have to vacate the fort and leave and pack up and everything, but actually it seems to be rather mild conditions.
Very. Montcalm's terms are actually unbelievably nice. Because he would have been within his rights, I think, to have perhaps allowed them to leave unmolested, but insisting that they leave behind their arms and, because again, the French were on that cusp of, finding life a bit desperate because of shortages. I know in the film he turns up with all his siege artillery and it's lovely, but and Monroe actually says, oh, he has more guns than me and they're bigger, but that wasn't going to last. And and Montcalm, being the man he was historically, would have been savvy enough to know that. So So to tell this not quite defeated garrison that you can take your weapons with you as long as pinky promise me that you will not fight on this continent again and you'll go home to Britain. I'll let you go. I think Monroe would have been a fool to have not accepted those
Yeah,
terms.
yeah.
Yes, but you do also. I do like the conversation that Montcalm has with Magua shortly afterwards, where he says, and this Monroe guy seems okay, but General Webb is not a man of honor, and I expect I will be. I'm a man of honor, but I expect I will be fighting these same men again as I advance further into British territory.
That's a
Um,
scene, by the way. That's a really good scene. And
yeah,
also, in a way, in the story, Monroe is in a very vulnerable position because he has his two daughters there. Uh,
yeah.
and switching in and out of being a father and a military man is not a position you want to be in such a dangerous situation.
No, no, because your judgment goes straight out the window. In fact, I'm quite impressed by the character in the movie who I would have not blamed him for starting to make really irrational decisions once his daughters get to the fort, but he keeps it together, largely speaking. Yes, and although I don't think he deals as well with the cultural shift in Cora as she becomes more and more sympathetic to Hawkeye um and they I think they almost begin to worry that she's going native, which she is, and a good thing too. To pick up on what you'd said earlier, I really love that scene where she is talking to Hawkeye while they're hiding from the
Yeah,
marauding war party, and they have this amazing conversation. And although she ends it by saying, you're right, we really don't understand one another, but you can see the realization is
yeah,
starting
yeah.
to pop up and
And for him as well, in a way, being a white man, for him as well, there is an understanding. But I do also like, because obviously there is a love story in this as well. But I do like that it's very subtle and it's not a sort of an obvious love story. And I do like the way they did that. And it's almost, especially towards the end of the film, it's almost like they don't use any dialogue on purpose and just let the scenery and the music do the talking.
yeah.
And you get the understanding anyway. Because we have a great love story, but we actually don't really have it in detail.
No,
It's
no, but
said or spoken.
yes, and it works so well because your imagination
Yeah,
fills in the
true.
details. It's a wonderful film for scripting because the dialogue is actually very tight. Nobody wastes words in Last of the Mohicans, and you're given. I mean, even that amazing conversation between Cora and Hawkeye it's not overstretched. It's condensed into such a short thing.
And
And
I
I
love
suppose,
that I think there is one scene at the fort that also says a lot about the cultures, and it's actually a very beautiful little scene where she is working, I think, in the surgery bit, and he stares at her, and she obviously goes, "What are you looking at, sir?" And he says, "I'm looking at you, miss." And her first reaction, of course, is one of slight unease. She tries to look away and looks a bit annoyed. And for him, there's nothing embarrassing about that. He's observing her in that moment and very obviously showing an interest, almost like animals do in nature. When they eye each other up. Um,
yes,
and
yeah.
and there's something very beautiful about that because it ends with both of them. They're not saying anything apart from that, but it ends with both of them smiling. Um,
Yeah,
and in a sort of mutual understanding and as you say, sympathy towards one another. And it's I think it's a very beautiful way of actually, yeah, highlighting that something is going on between them, but also that uh, the communication is not with words here in this landscape, in this culture, in this setting. The communication is direct, yes, but it's not done in words.
yeah. And yeah, that's absolutely right. And it is a wonderful, wonderful moment. And it stands in such contrast, I find, because yes, you're right about her being uncomfortable at first because it's she likes it, but it's not what she's used to. And it's such a contrast to the bit at the beginning of the film where Duncan Hayward is doing this very contractual type of like, yes, I know we're just friends, but you really should consider marrying me because of all these, really quite level-headed reasons. But there's no spark, and I completely understand why Cora hesitates and is like, can I not give you an answer straight away? Because off camera, that was the most unconvincing proposal I've ever heard.
It was the convenience, and that was in a way, and again, that's done brilliantly because that highlights, the very conservative British way of doing this. It would be convenient if you and I were to marry.
Yes.
It would be very sensible of us. Yes, I know there's no spark, but it would be very sensible. And so it highlights that as well. Whereas that relationship with Hawkeye, as it develops, becomes one based totally not on sense and convenience, but totally on liking and passion. Uh,
Mm.
and those opposites are so very, very, palpable in throughout the entire thing.
Yeah, yeah, and the characterization supports it. They're very I can't think of anyone in this film, even the bit part characters, who comes across as a sort of cardboard cutout character because they're all really well-rounded and even Hayward in the end. There's that incredibly redemptive moment where, of course, because Hawkeye doesn't speak French, where he
Yeah.
sacrifices himself and you think, oh, actually, yeah, you weren't such a bad guy after all. And
But there is also, I think, in that it's interesting about that sacrifice because he is, along with another character I found really, really interesting. He's the only one making a choice about his own to end his own life. The other person, of course, being Alice, the young girl. And yes, he's in an absolutely hopeless situation there. But there's something very poignant about those two deaths, especially because they seem to be a choice of their own
yeah, yeah,
in the midst of all this slaughter going on. But that is a fantastic scene as well. And also, of course, that Hawkeye ends up ending his life because in a merciful way by shooting him on the fire there because that
yeah,
um but I think also just I'm not sure I'm going to call this a romance, but let's call it a connection then between young Alice and Uncas. Uh,
mm,
because that is so unbelievably subtle because there's never really any dialogue between the two of them.
yeah,
Cora, of course, being the protective older sister, she's even saying after their father has died, do not tell Alice about this. And you can tell that the young girl knows already. Um, and the only real conversation we have between the two of them is during that waterfall scene where she's stepping a bit too close to the edge and he's sort of pulling her back in and holding her. Uh,
mm,
but apart from that, you don't really have, as you say, it's your imagination as a viewer on that works here, how much you want to put into that relationship. But it's a beautiful way of creating a connection that's almost like her older sisters between her and these native people that she shares absolutely nothing with at the very beginning.
yeah, and everyone in this film, I think, was beautifully cast because I think Alice was played by Jodie May, who I don't.
Yes, yeah,
And I'm not really aware of any other films she's been in, but she's got very expressive eyes
yes,
and the acting with
very
her
young.
and Uncas, who I think was Eric Schweig, they
Yes,
both act with their eyes
yeah.
very, very well.
And I
There's so much
think
expression there.
yes, and it's a beautiful, beautiful scenes there. And I think, in a way, Alice is the one undertaking the biggest transformation because when we meet her, she's this very young, naive schoolgirl, but
Mm.
she ends up bearing witness to all this slaughter and misery and things she's never even dreamt of before. And then it's almost like when Uncas is being murdered and sort of pushed over the edge towards the end, it's almost like you can see it in her eyes. This is enough now. This got to stop now. And she makes that decision. And that scene becomes even more poignant in the Huron's reaction to her, because in a way, Magua could just, reach out and pull her back in forcefully, but he doesn't. He sort of slowly, he's holding a knife, and slowly it falls down to his side, and he raises his other hand, and he sort of go, come back, come. But he doesn't reach out or anything. He's just looking at this young girl as she's making this decision. And there's almost something I was about to say in that thing about being connected with nature as well. There is almost an accept in that moment in him that she has now made that decision, and there's not really anything I can do about that.
Yes.
And it's a very, very powerful scene, that one.
Yes, and it also adds quite a bit to the richness of Magua's character, because I think superficially, although you get his backstory fairly early on, he is the kind of guy you like to hate, because he revels in his cruelty. And but then the more you look at him, the more you go, well, his wife and family were, they were caught up in this war, and irrespective of whether Monroe was directly responsible for their deaths, or whether it was people under his command that he had no control over. You can understand where this blood feud comes from, this hatred that drives him, this desire for vengeance. But I think if he had been a complete irredeemable bad guy, he would have just snatched Alice back from the cliff edge and gone, "No, you're mine now. You're my property," and that's the end of it. But yes, you're right. He perceives that something is going on in her mind, and he presents her with a choice rather than depriving her of any agency. And again, it's the amazing subtlety of this film. It's not overstated, and we're not spoon-fed, but there's so much happening in that moment. And yeah, he's a very difficult character, because yes, there's certain bits of him
Villain,
one
isn't
loves to
he?
hate, but he's also quite a tragic figure, really.
He's a very complex villain. You're right, because you understand him. You want to hate him, but you do understand him, and you do understand the cruelty behind what he's doing.
Yeah. And also I wonder, again, it's left to your imagination. I wonder if he is aware of the sort of misery he's pushing himself into, because the disrespect he shows his own elder when he doesn't get his way, that's the kind of thing you simply don't do in that culture. So he's effectively banished himself
That's
from his own people, by that show of defiance. And although he still has his little collection of friends who'll go with him,
yeah.
I don't get the feeling they go with him out of love. It's more out of fear. And
You even see that towards the end when he dies, that Hawkeye is kind of holding the rest back as that fight between the two of them takes place. So I don't think they're particularly loyal necessarily to him or his cause. The moment he dies, they sort of give up. And
yes, yeah. Yeah, and it's the sensible thing, It's like, I
yeah,
don't. If he dies, yes, he's our boss, but we're freed from this
yeah,
terrifying person
yeah.
who's been dominating our lives for a bit.
And Andrew, I know I always mention this, but I just have to again, particularly in this last scene, the soundtrack.
No, you must. If you
It,
didn't, I would have. The
this
music
is
is,
masterful. You have such a long final scene with basically no dialogue apart from that absolutely masterful soundtrack. And the
yeah,
brilliance of it is this rhythmic repetition of harmonies. And it's almost staccato. There's a very clear beat. There's a very ba 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 ba. And
yeah,
this happens as they run through, they're in pursuit, they run through the landscape. You can almost hear that rhythmic stamping of your feet on the ground. There's it ba 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 ba, and it goes on and it goes on and it goes on and it goes on. And there is then from time to time you get these different layers of strings. So when you have the big epic panorama view, you have the full layer of strings. And then when you zoom back to one of the characters, usually one in pursuit, you have a single, usually a violin or viola, playing those harmonies up and down. So the music there is totally doing that dialogue for them, and they don't really need anything else. But it's such a stroke of brilliance to let the cinematography, as you mentioned, the music and those stunning pictures, this just tell the story in that scene, especially.
Yeah, yeah, it comes together so well, and I forget who the composer was, but they're a genius.
Trevor Jones and oh, I should have written that down. Randy Edelman, and they've worked together before, I think. But I think they wrote, one of them wrote half of the track, and the other one the other half of the track. But this particular song, the main theme was actually a, oh gosh, was it Irish or Scottish folk song? You will know, guys. Comment that they took and sort of took the harmonies out of it and highlighted. So the harmonies became the main melody of the song, and the melody sort of took a background in the final music version of this. But I cannot remember if it was an Irish or a Scottish folk song. But guys, you will know. Comment.
Oh, I think, yeah, correct me if I'm wrong too, guys. Comments. But I think it might be the Gale, the
Yes,
Scottish piece. Is
thank
it
you.
the Gale?
Thank you. That's the one. That's the one.
I got a music round question right. Oh my God, that never happens.
You're so, I'd forgotten. You're so right. But it has these beautiful harmonies. And
Yeah.
of course, what they did with the soundtrack was just to highlight those and sort of turn them into the melody, the main melody, which works so well, so well. And then you have other, I think it's Clannad who has that beautiful, what's it called? I Will Find You.
Oh, wherever you go, I will find you.
Yes,
Yes. Yeah.
that was
Um,
beautiful. You know, they had some really amazing ones in the 90s as well. Some absolutely beautiful soundtracks and songs as well going on. That sound was really good for this kind of movie. But no, you're right. It's just a brilliant example of when everything comes together and works perfectly. And then I think that omission of dialogue is just brilliant as well, because you don't need any talk over this.
no, no. In fact, you'd almost get a bit resentful if people kept babbling over that. It's like, no, shut up. I want to listen. Uh, yeah, but it is such a wonderfully crafted film in all respects, and I marvel at the talent of people who can bring all this together and make something so beautiful and such an effective bit of storytelling. And I've also said I think the cast are amazing. Scarily young-looking Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yeah, we got to mention Daniel Day-Lewis, don't we? He was born for this role, wasn't he?
Oh yes, yes. It fits him like a glove. And one of the other things I liked now as time has passed, I think some criticism has been leveled at the film for being a bit too simplistic in its representation of the American Indians who are in it. Certainly their cultures, you know, there's a danger that they look a bit too similar. But I did admire it for the time because I think it was two of the actors, and certainly the one who played Chingachgook,
Right.
both are of Native American descent, which was a major thing in the early 90s.
That was unusual back then. That was really unusual back then. But you're right. You are so right. And it does add something, doesn't it, to their
Yeah,
songs especially. There is a peculiar, as you say, they speak a lot with their eyes, but there's also a very compelling presence over just the way they look and the way they stand and the way they hold. It's very unapologetic. And I think also in that scene where the Hawkeye is looking at Cora and he says, "I'm looking at you, Miss." That's the sort of unapologetic, almost too straightforward. I mean, the rest of us are too born and brought up with, you know, social principles and standards and polite ways of acting and so on. Where
yeah.
this is just straightforward. I'm looking at you because I'm admiring you. You know.
Yes, yeah, it drifts towards was it Montaigne's term, the noble, the concept of the noble savage who's not burdened with all this, there's these layers of social rules and you have to act this way, and there's all this weird chaff and clouds of confusion surrounding what our relative status is and how I must talk to you. You're right, they just exist in that moment, and it's just like, yes, I'm looking at you because I admire you, and that why are you looking embarrassed?
Why would you do that? And I think that presence is very much in these elderly men's faces as well. That's a very, very compelling presence in the way. Also, of course, obviously in the entire costume and all of that kind of thing. But there is a very you can't really keep your eyes off them. There's something very, very beautiful in that sort of, you can almost see the wisdom behind the eyes.
Yes, yes, and I think there's also, because you talked about the way they stand and hold themselves. I think there's also an undercurrent of that confidence that comes with being on your own home turf.
Yeah.
It does strike me that aside from the settlers, again, because they've lived there a while, the newly arrived Europeans, even the minor characters, there's this very slight edginess to them because
Yes.
they're strangers in a strange land, and this is definitely not their backyard, even though they've planted their flags, and this is our backyard now. But but they're very aware, I think, of how fragile their presence there feels, and how alien this whole world and these people they've encountered are to them. So of course you feel a bit vulnerable and kind of, oh,
Yeah.
um, it's not something I want to make too much of, because I don't know whether it was incidental or whether it was an incredibly clever piece of directing, just to say, guys, just look like you don't belong here. I mean, you're standing in a forest wearing, either white or red jackets, so you look like you don't belong here anyway. But look like you don't belong here.
No, that is true. That is true. And I'm guessing that I'm not really sure how to interpret that scene, but the scene where Hawkeye is walking into the camp just before Duncan is being put on the fire there, he's sort of walking in very vulnerable, showing that he's unarmed and his collar's there, and they are kind of allowed to attack him
Hmm.
as he walks forward, but he has to move on. He has to get up and move on. Um, and there is also a way of saying, I'm aware I'm stepping in on your ground. I'm aware that I am almost trespassing here, but I come here with a message. I come here for a purpose, and yes, you are allowed to hit me and kick me and whatever you want to do, but as long as I get up and move on. And then you see, as he is doing that a couple of times after someone I think cuts him and another one hits him or kicks him or whatever, they start to move back a little bit and allow him to pass, because he's
Yeah.
kind of shown now that I'm serious. I will keep moving, although you keep hitting me.
Yes, and it's a huge gamble, because I imagine in an alternate universe, the elder, if he had not been as wise and level-headed as he is in the film, could have just said, "Oh no, I can't be dealing with this. I've got to just take him outside and kill him."
Yeah.
So there was always that risk that he could have done that, and it really puts a very different dimension to Hawkeye's actions there. Yeah, the parlay scene, it is incredible. And again, Daniel Day-Lewis and his acting, there's that wonderful look of determination on his face, because he has so much at stake at this point in the film. But I like to think I detect, when I watch that scene, just a tiny little bit of concern in his eyes as well, because it was like, if I've totally miscalculated this, their chief will just tell them to kill me, and
Yeah.
it won't have solved anything.
And I think you're right, because I think we see the panic in his eye as well because he doesn't speak French, so he cannot communicate. So he relies on the translation, and then he realized, he said, "No, take me instead, take me instead." And then he realizes that they take Duncan instead, and he's kind of sacrificed himself instead. But that panic in his eyes when he realizes that's what's going on, you know.
Yes, because for all he knew, Duncan could have been
Yes,
saying, yes, put him on the fire and give the woman to me.
yes, exactly. And I think actually you talk about this uncertainty as well. We do see that there's a beautiful dialogue as well in that waterfall scene where he realizes that you are better off if we leave. If we leave, there is a chance you survive. But as long as we're here, they most certainly will kill us all.
Mm.
And effectively what he's saying there when he tells her, you know, just survive, you're strong, just survive, whatever happens, just survive. Effectively what he's saying is, you know, no matter what they do to you, just make sure that you stay alive, and I will come and find you. But that is a huge gamble as well.
Yes, and in that period and at that time, I mean, I don't know how aware Cora would have been because on the one hand, she's a new arrival. On the other hand, she's seen and learned a lot, including the ruins of that farmstead that one of the raiding parties had hit. The wars on the frontiers were very much a war. It was a war without mercy, and of course, as we know from Europe's rather sad history in this period, even though there were rules officially about how you were supposed to treat civilians, they were not always observed. But in the cultures that inhabited Northern America at the time, there were no such rules. And you know, so simply being a woman on your own does not exclude you from being a legitimate target. I can't imagine what was going through Cora's head because I think part of her would have probably thought, actually, I'd rather you stay here, even if
Help
it's
me
our
out.
fate to get
And
slaughtered. What are you doing? Don't leave me here.
I think even Duncan is saying coward because in his British mind, this is the cowardly thing to do. You're running away, you're fleeing.
Yes, yes, the men should die first, trying to protect the women folk. That's the European chivalrous view of it. Yeah, and again, it's that clash of cultures because it does make sense what Hawkeye says. You know, their blood won't be up so much if there's just a bunch of helpless targets, and you're probably of more value to them as prisoners.
Yeah.
But if shots are fired, well, our powder's wet. But if shots are fired, you know, they won't stop till everyone's dead. So
And I think another, just to mention those culture clash as well, that settler scene with where they want to bury them, and how can you be so indifferent and how can you be so cold and unfeeling, and he doesn't really answer because he could have had an opportunity of saying, you know, they're really close friends, but
mm,
instead he just goes, they stay as they lay, and then he walks away, and that's a wonderful line as well to pull off in that moment. But you can, behind that sentence, you can feel the grief, you can feel the,
yeah.
and the anger really boiling there.
Yes, to us his pain is very evident, and I love the camera angle because you see Hawkeye walking towards you, you can see the look on his face, and Cora, of course, can't see this, and she's behind him, just going,
Yeah.
"Believable, what?" But it's great because, of course, we can see her too, and we can see
Yes.
the shock and the outrage. Um, yeah, it's beautifully constructed that moment, and it was a very powerful scene. Because when I came back to watch this again, before we did the video, it'd been a long time since I'd watched it, and I'd actually, I'm ashamed to say, I'd actually forgotten that really quite deep moment when they passed the farmstead, and I just thought, actually, yeah, you know, it's
But
another
you're right,
thing.
it does said a lot, it did say a lot about just how insecure that life was. And
Yes.
it was everyone, you know, even women and children, no one was safe, really.
No, no, and as the conflict spread and became more bitter, if anything, it started to get a little bit worse after a while because war dehumanizes anyway, and when it becomes and when you're dealing with cultures who have very different rules to yours, you start to think, well, all right then, anything goes. And yes, even after the tide of war turns and the British begin to win a few years in the future, not a lot is done to try and make things better. In fact, on occasions during that war, there's even the excuse that, oh, you turn a blind eye to the butchery, but then if someone hauls you up on it, you say, oh, well, it was my Indian allies going crazy, and there are allies. It's not like I'm their absolute commander. If they want to do that, that's what they're going to do. But it was a way of covering that the atrocities were actually, the guilt for the atrocities was actually more evenly spread than that.
Yeah, true. Andrew, there was one final thing I thought we should talk about as well, because we haven't talked about this epic scene, another epic scene, which is the battle and the attack.
Yeah.
Because that's actually, can you say this about a battle scene? It's actually really beautiful.
Well, yes, you can actually, because it's beautifully shot. I mean, from a technical perspective, trying to give an indication of a battle, I think, where a long strung out column of people, surrounded by woodland, are
It's
ambushed from all sides. It's actually a really tough battle scene to film. And I think they did it. I'll use that word again. They did it beautifully because the way they control the camera angles and the way they direct it, you keep moving from the head of the column to sections within the column, and seeing how different people react. Because of course it's a mixed column, so some people are panicking, others are forming up to try and make a defense.
You do get a sense of the different sections within that drawn out there are civilians, there are women with children, and there are the soldiers and the officers at the front, and you do get a sense of that, and the panic just spreading in that very long vulnerable line of people there.
Yes, yeah, and I think it was brilliantly done because it just shows how messy these things could become. I quite I quite liked how the film treated it because you don't quite see the end of the engagement. You only see it from the perspective of the
Yeah.
participants. I mean, in Monroe's case, up to the moment he
Yeah.
dies, and then but yes, when the others manage to escape and leave it behind them, there's still, the fighting's still raging, and there's a bit of a question mark over it. Because of course, a slight curiosity is that historically, there was a Colonel Monroe, although he didn't have any daughters involved. And his column, when he was trying to get to Fort Edward, with a fair number of civilians as well as soldiers, was actually attacked in the way that the film shows. But they did actually manage to beat the attack off in the end. And then it allowed Monroe to reach Fort Edward and then say very rude things about General Webb. Webb subsequently lost his job. But when you read Monroe's very brief report of the action, it's substantially the same kind of thing that happens in the film, that you get attacked from all sides. It's very difficult for the troops because they're trying to protect the civilians as well as themselves, but it's incredibly difficult to try and communicate with each other to to keep a sense of what's happening, because and once the guns start firing, there's smoke everywhere. You get problems because you have your Indian allies with you, but if you're a relatively uneducated European, you can't tell a Cherokee from a Mohican or any other, or a Huron, and in the panic of the moment you go, Indian, and bring up your musket, and the guy might be a friend, so
Yes. Yeah.
it's completely insane. And I think the battle was very beautifully done.
And
And
even I remember thinking the way it started, you have one attacker coming into the column, attacking a man, attacking one of the soldiers, in almost a sort of I'm a little too eager to get this battle started sort of way, and you get this there's a slight bit of panic sort of spreading there. What was that? What's going on? And then of course you hear that war cry coming from the forest in front of you. And it was a brilliant way of starting that, because how do you, even from a cinematography kind of perspective, how do you start that? If they've just sort of bursted out, all of them at the same time, it would have looked a little bit like too much of a mess from the beginning. So this was
Yes.
actually a very nice little sort of, hey, what was that? What was going to, what's going on? Where did he come from? Kind of moment, you know.
Yes, they build it slowly, don't they? So you get some groups creeping close and firing into the column, and then you get a couple of other groups sort of going mad like Oscar and just jumping straight in. And yeah, and
Attack.
yes, yeah, no, he's busy itching himself in a corner. No, it's a younger man's game, he says.
Fair.
Yeah, and even when they're in the midst of the battle, when the groups have finally, disintegrated into a big struggling mass, it's very clever how they manage to wander around and capture all these things. Because you're right, I think if they'd just done a headlong rush from the trees, they would have driven all their extras mad because it was the kind of thing you would have had to have reshot and reshot and reshot to get loads of different angles. Hopefully, for the sanity of all concerned, you only had to do it a couple of times, and
Good
and
point.
hope and hopefully for the sanity of the makeup and props department as well, because in scenes like that, once you've messed up an actor by doing the theater blood on them, you really don't want to have to scrub it off again. Now, don't look dead. We're going to shoot that again. And of course, weapons get broken because everything's made of balsa wood, and
And
people
another
lose their
quite
kit.
clever bit is we of course get Hawkeye, who's at the very back as a prisoner. But we also get a sense of just how many people and how long this column was by just how long it takes him to find Cora at the very front, because he's
Yeah.
in and out of quite a few battles on his way to her. So that was actually brilliantly done as well, that it takes him quite a long time just to reach her, just to reach that front end. And on his way, of course, we get to see what's going on in the different sections of that battle scene.
Yes, yeah. The thing I find most terrifying watching it again is you have absolutely no idea what the bigger picture is. There's just this struggling mass of humanity around you, and you're going absolutely frantic because the person you love is out there somewhere. And it's hard enough to find that particular needle in this crazy haystack, but every now and then someone pops up trying to kill you just to distract you even further. And
No, and
yeah, and you're right, the length of the column too, because you're not even within shouting distance. You can't just call out and hope that they'll hear you because there's absolutely no way. You'd just be wasting your time and your breath doing that.
but it was actually, I think that's why I call that scene beautiful, because it demonstrates so many things at the same time. The landscape, the way you could hide, the way a
Mm.
column was organized, the way they organized themselves when under attack, whether cleverly or not. The way civilians just panicked and fled in the midst of all this. And as you said, Andrew, that just uh, overwhelming brutality of near combat, and also the way, in a way, that way in the Native Americans fight, because the point is not necessarily to kill your opponent. The point is to disable him from any further battle.
Yeah.
So, and you get to see that a few times with Hawkeye along the way, where he is he's not necessarily shooting or fighting to kill. He is disabling you from any further attack. Uh,
Yeah.
and that approach, also again in stark contrast to the way the soldiers fight. So there's so many things that are really telling in that scene. And it's done fantastically. And you also say the fact that we don't really get to see how it ends. We just sort of leaving it there in the chaos as our
Yeah.
main characters flee.
Yeah, and it's great because I think if they had wandered back to show anything, it would have actually detracted from the film because
Yeah.
you're so invested in these handful of people anyway, that what happens back there is, it's happening.
Just want
And
to get away. It's almost like you want to get away from it as well as a viewer. You just want to get out of that chaos now.
yeah, yeah, and it's just like, well, we've made it, so it's fine. So we're gonna make our escape downriver or wherever we're going. And
True, true. Is there anything else, Andrew, or are we reaching the time where we should hand over to people? Because I'm pretty sure a lot of people would have much to say about this one.
oh, absolutely. Well, as always, they've been incredibly patient. So I think we've probably reached handover time. I mean, I can't think of anything. Oh, except there was just one thing. Of course, the film's titled "Last of the Mohicans," so there's a bit of irony in the fact that apparently, um, there are something in the order of maybe 1,000 registered Mohicans living in the US today. So it's not. It may have been. I don't know anything about them. So it may have been that they were a tribe who were
Yeah.
in decline at the time. But the beautiful thing is that they are still there today.
That's a brilliant point to end on, actually. But you actually reminded me of something, because I do remember, if there was one bit of criticism to Cooper's otherwise brilliant story, it was that it was very simplistic in the way it described these people. It was almost sometimes a little bit cartoonish in the way it described the Native Americans, which could have been just the way of doing it at the time. I mean, we have to remember this is a very old novel,
Mhm.
but I think you're right in it. Obviously, a piece of fiction, and he does get a lot of wonderful points with him that otherwise wouldn't have been described about a people who were, as you say, potentially dying out. But it is a wonderful note, actually, that there are Mohicans still around.
Yes, yes, and no, I've often wondered because there's the jury's very much out on how well Cooper's story has aged, especially in the specifics that you mentioned. I think he's. I know you're sailing into dangerous waters when you start to use phrases like "man of his time," so I'll try and avoid that. But in the context, I mean, presumably he wrote the novel through the 1820s prior to its publication, so that's a very early
It is.
date, and attitudes, particularly among, I mean, you could call them Americans by then, very young nation, but the attitudes of Europeans had really that I don't think they had progressed very much, unless you happen to be one of those Europeans who lived with the Native Americans and understood them and had a sympathy with them. And there were quite a few of those. But if you were writing from the comfort of your study in a distant city, then it's actually impossible to have any kind of cultural understanding. And even if you take the trouble to ask people who've encountered the Indians or who know the Indians, you're not you still can't have that depth of understanding. And I do sometimes wonder whether his treatment of them in the book maybe stemmed from a level of cultural ignorance. I mean, it's been a very long time since I read the book. I never detect any malice in it. I think it's always struck me as just cultural ignorance, and you're filling in the gaps from what little you
I
know.
think sometimes we have to remember that it's not, when we describe something or someone, a group of people, in a very specific way, it's not necessarily out of malice. It's although the after time may look at it that way, but it's simply because we are approaching this from a specific angle at the time.
Yes.
And we might call people something we would never call them in the future. But we just, I think, sometimes need to remember that when we look at older books, publications, films, and so on, that there are. I mean, we talked about some time ago, we talked about Casablanca from the 40s, and there were phrases and words that probably wouldn't have been used today if you were making the movie today. But we just
Yes.
have to remember that they were coming from a different time. They're not necessarily coming from a place of evil.
Absolutely, yes, yes, and actually, I mean, as when you compare it to Last of the Mohicans to a lot of the other literature that was emerging in the early 19th century, it actually passes the test of time really well, and it's aged well as a classic, I think. Yes, and actually, like the book, the film I felt has aged very, very well.
Yeah, still a beautiful film.
Yeah, and yes, do you know what? I still have my CD with the soundtrack on it from the 1990s, and I don't have anything to play it on, but and it's also on my Spotify account. So
I have the same problem. I have the same. You just can't throw away CDs, can you? It's just it's a little too precious. It's from the 90s. It's a
yeah, yeah, they're loaded. I mean, there's this the beauty of a physical object. It's loaded with memory, and you know, I remember the excitement of buying it.
I bought this with my pocket money and I saved and saved.
Yeah, yeah, and it was and it's even funnier when I remember the price of CDs back then.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Oh,
Yeah.
you got to keep that one, Andrew.
I will. Yes, we still have a stack of CDs in the house that I'll never get rid of. Just
One day they'll be worth a lot of money.
they might well be. Yes, yeah, it's another reason to hang on to the the vinyl of our times. I'm really sorry to all you vinyl fans out there. I realize I've just spouted heresy, but
Oh, but guys, let us know what you think about this brilliant, brilliant film. And if we've probably only mentioned like a fraction of what you guys can come up with, there's so many things to discuss. And please comment and link to whatever you want to link to, and let us know what we've forgotten or got wrong in this. It would be really great to hear from you.
yeah, we really love to to have you join in, and as Jane says, we've only scratched the surface of this amazing film. So really looking forward to what you all have to say.
Yep, true. And take care, and we'll be back someday, suddenly.
Someday soon, I hope. Yes, we need to think what the next one's going to be, but I'll look forward to that.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone. And thanks so much, Andrew.
My pleasure as always, Jane. Take care, everyone. See you again soon in the next one. And as always, Jane, for a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew.